Our fifth and final lesson in our ecology unit is ecosystems, and we've already learned that an ecosystem is a large area made of living and non-living things in the environment. So we'll be studying the living biotic factors and how they're related to the non-living abiotic factors. Within ecosystems, one of the main emphasis is placed on energy transfer, food chains, food webs, food pyramids, biomass pyramids. So the first thing we need to make sure that you understand is the various trophic levels, or these are feeding levels, within food chains. The word trophic simply means feeding. So feeding levels. If we're looking at the diagram to the right, ultimately, and this would be 99.9% of the time, the ultimate source of energy is the sun. Now, are there exceptions? Yes, but only in the deepest parts of the ocean. There are some deep ocean critters that obtain their energy from sulfur compounds that bubble out of the earth. Obviously, in the deep parts of the ocean, there is no sunlight that can penetrate that far. But generally speaking, we say most of the time the ultimate source of energy is the sun. So that solar energy is converted to chemical energy through the process of photosynthesis, and that is carried out by primary producers. Now, you don't always have to use the word primary. Some textbooks do not, because there's no such thing as a second producer in a food chain. They're always at the base of the food chain. They are eaten by primary consumers. So the first animal that eats the plant is the primary consumer, primary meaning first. So they have to always be herbivores, a plant eater. Then the next animal that eats the first animal in the chain is a secondary consumer. And of course they're eating meat, so they're a carnivore. And then in this particular food chain, we've got detritus here at the top of the chain, being devoured or broken down by microorganisms. Bacteria, could be fungi. These would be your decomposers. And anything that breaks down detritus, which is simply decaying matter, can be called a detritivore. So they can actually go any place in the food chain. You can see that our producers are dying and forming decaying matter, detritus, being then broken down by decomposers and detritivores. And the same thing is happening with the primary consumers, if you follow that arrow, and the secondary consumers. So they can actually fit anywhere in the food chain. And here we have a picture of a decaying log being broken down to detritus, organic waste and remains of dead organism. Again, any place in the chain, once any organism dies. So here's our definition. So just make sure you know the definitions of producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. Now we can take any food chain, or web for that matter, and that chain can be converted into a pyramid. And usually the pyramid is wide at the bottom and narrower at the top. These can be called pyramids of numbers, because as you go from your producers to primary consumers, to, in this case, secondary consumers, because this particular pyramid only has 3 trophic levels, the numbers of organisms at each trophic level decreases as you go from producer to tertiary consumer, or in this case, secondary consumer. The energy decreases as you go up the food chain, and the biomass decreases. Biomass is simply dry mass of organic matter. So if we took all the trees and producers at the base of this food chain, dehydrate them by removing their water, and then find the mass of all that organic matter that's left, that is biomass. Since there are more trees at the base of the food chain, there's more dry mass or more biomass, and there would be less in the giraffes and less in the lions. So all of these things generally decrease as you pass up to higher trophic levels, or up the food chain. So we can show this pyramidal type shape to illustrate that. Now, speaking of the energy, just how much energy do we lose as we go up the pyramid or the chain? You can see this pyramid is kind of drawn like a bar graph, and it kind of better illustrates how our energy is lost as we go up the food chain. Joules are energy units. You'll learn that more and use the unit more in, say, chemistry or physics than you would in biology, but this is just to illustrate what we call the 10% law. The 10% law says only 10% of the energy at one trophic level gets transferred to the next trophic level, which means 90% of the energy is actually lost. Now, where does it go? There are laws of thermodynamics that govern energy transfer, and we know that the first law of thermodynamics says energy cannot be created, it cannot be destroyed, so energy can't truly be lost, but it's becoming unusable. That's a better term here. We don't really lose energy, but it's becoming unusable to the animals and the plants in the chain. It is converted to heat, and this heat simply escapes into the universe as an unusable source of energy. So if we go back and look at this diagram again, that's what you're seeing by all of these dotted pink arrows. That's representing that 90% of energy that is coming out as heat, becoming unusable with every energy transfer here. The blue arrows would be the energy that's actually usable. So the blue arrows are the 10% and the dotted pink arrows are the 90% being unusable converted to heat. So 10% law. We only get 10%. 90% is lost to us in the form of heat. Be careful with your food chains. The direction of the arrow is important. Sometimes they'll try to fool you by reversing the direction of the arrow. The arrow shows the direction the energy is transferred. The energy is going from the plant into the cutworm, from the cutworm into the garter snake, etc. If we were to reverse the arrows, it would mean the marsh hawk is going into the body of the upland sandpiper, and we know that's not the case. So be careful of the order of the organisms and the direction of the arrows. Multiple food chains can be placed into food webs, and they're a little bit harder to interpret because you obviously have much more arrows. Now this one, I've looked at this a little while, and we looked at it in class, and I can't really understand this arrow right here where it appears to be a double arrow. I don't think that arrow head should be right there on this. I think these should be all one way going up instead of this. But you would have this diagram, and you could be asked questions like, which of the following organisms would not be a secondary consumer in this food chain? Well, we know that the vole and the earthworm and the insect would not be a secondary consumer because they're eating the primary producers. They're eating the autotrophs, the grasses and the composites down here. So they would be primary consumers. Or they could say, which of the following is a tertiary consumer, and they could give you choices and you pick that. So you need to be familiar with how to interpret food webs. That's a very common type of question that you see on exams. Okay, kind of switching gears a little bit now, we're going to talk about primary productivity. A lot of times you will hear ecologists talk about biomes or ecosystems and how productive they are. Well, what does that word productive or productivity really mean? Well, in ecology, we use the term primary productivity to describe the amount of light energy that's actually being converted to sugars by all those autotrophs or primary producers in that ecosystem. So what is light being converted to sugar? Well, that's photosynthesis. So primary productivity is simply a measure of the amount of photosynthesis taking place in an ecosystem. The more photosynthesis there is taking place by those producers, the more productive that ecosystem is. So tropical rainforests are highly productive ecosystems. In the ocean, you'll see a little graph in a little bit. In the ocean, because you have so much algae there and so much phytoplankton or plant plankton, they are very productive ecosystems. There's a lot of primary productivity going on there. But we can subdivide the category of primary productivity into two types: gross and net. Gross versus net primary productivity. if you think about how we use the terms gross and net when it comes to our paychecks, you know, when you get a job and they say you're going to earn $50,000 per year, well, that's gross. Gross is the biggest number, the total. But do you actually get the benefit of all that $50,000? No, because we have taxes withheld and various other things withheld from that total salary, and the net is the amount left over that you actually have available to you after all those deductions. So net is always going to be a smaller number than the gross. Gross is the bigger number. So when it comes to productivity, photosynthesis, what could we physically measure to determine how much productivity is taking place? How much photosynthesis is taking place? Well, photosynthesis uses what gas? It uses carbon dioxide. It produces what gas? Produces oxygen. And of course, the ultimate goal is it produces the sugar glucose. So we could measure any of those things. We could measure how much carbon dioxide is being used. We could measure how much oxygen is being produced. Or we could somehow measure how much sugar is being produced. I can tell you in our laboratory here with the equipment that we have, the easiest thing to measure would be the carbon dioxide being used or the oxygen gas being produced, because we do have probes that hook to our LabQuest that you'll see later in the year that measure oxygen gas and carbon dioxide gas. So that's something that we could easily measure. So a plant makes a whole lot of sugar and a whole lot of oxygen through photosynthesis. That would be the gross number, the gross primary productivity. But is all of that going to be available for the next organisms in the food chain? No, because that plant uses some of that sugar in its own cellular respiration. And it uses some of that oxygen gas that it's producing in photosynthesis to carry out its own aerobic cellular respiration. So R here is respiration. So the gross photosynthesis, the total amount of sugar, the total amount of oxygen being produced, minus the amount that the plant uses in its own respiration, leaves the net amount. And that net is going to be the actual amount that's available for the next level in the food chain. So that would be the amount that's available for that primary consumer that's going to eat that plant. It's a smaller value than the gross. So let's look at these bar graphs. We have 3 bar graphs here. The one on the left shows the percentage of the Earth's surface covered by these various terrestrial and aquatic biomes. If the bar is green, it's a terrestrial area. If the bar is blue, it's an aquatic area. We can see this blue bar at the very top, the open ocean, is not drawn to scale compared to all the others because we have this little break right here in the bar. So obviously 65% of the Earth is covered with open ocean, and 5% of that is over the continental shelf, and then down here we've got the other brackish and freshwater zones like swamps and lakes and estuaries, and then all the green bars again are our terrestrial biomes that we've learned the characteristics of. The middle graph is showing the average net primary productivity. This would be the amount of sugar or oxygen available for the next level of the food chain after those producers use their fair share of it. So the biggest bar we can see here are the algal beds and the coral reefs. They're highly photosynthetic, and they use less of it maybe than some of these terrestrial ones. So some scientists estimate that as much as 80% of our oxygen actually comes from algae. And we think of algae as kind of being bad, slimy stuff, but it really isn't. They're very, very important because of the amount of oxygen and sugar that they make. So they're important in these food chains. If we wiped out all the algae, these food chains would be much disturbed, and we would probably not have the amount of oxygen that we need on this earth. And then this far right column is the percentage of the Earth's net primary productivity, percentage. rather than grams like we have here. So we can see, you know, percentage-wise, the open ocean is giving us most of our photosynthesis. Now, limiting nutrients. There are certain nutrients that autotrophs, mainly our plants and our algae, would need to carry out photosynthesis or primary productivity. And that's going to, some of those are going to overlap in aquatic ecosystems versus terrestrial. In water, the main limiting nutrient that would shut down photosynthesis happens to be light, because obviously most sunlight doesn't reach a great depth in bodies of water, especially murky water, say like Smith Mountain Lake. You know, that water is not penetrating, say, more than a foot in most areas. So in Smith Mountain Lake, you've only got photosynthesis really taking place at the surface. Because all plants and autotrophs need nitrogen and phosphorus as nutrients for carrying out photosynthesis, and they use it up very, very rapidly. Those are often limiting nutrients that kind of shut down primary productivity when the plant doesn't have enough of them. Same thing in terrestrial ecosystems, and this is why we have to add a lot of fertilizers to our soils to replenish those as the plants remove them from the soil year after year after year. But also temperature on land can be a limiting nutrient. Not every plant can grow in hot temperatures. Not every plant can grow in cold temperatures. And likewise, moisture. You know, not every plant can carry out photosynthesis in a desert environment. And not every plant can carry out photosynthesis in an area that gets an abundance of rain like a tropical rainforest. So anything that would shut down productivity or photosynthesis would be a limiting nutrient. And these are the most common ones. We need to be able to trace the path of these nutrients in what we call biogeochemical cycles. We're going to look at 4 nutrient cycles. Why are they biogeochemical? Well, the nutrients flow from living things to the earth, geo means earth, in chemical form. The one that you learned first, probably in about 3rd or 4th grade, is the water cycle, or we could call it the hydrologic cycle. Hydro always means water. And this one's really super easy. So again, almost 3/4 of the surface of the earth is covered with water. That water heats up due to energy from the sun, and it evaporates, turning from liquid to gas. As it evaporates, it moves up into the air, and generally as we go up in the troposphere, temperature decreases. And as the temperature decreases, so when the water cools, it condenses back from gas to liquid and becomes clouds, so that's condensation. And then when the clouds become so full of water that it can't be supported by the winds any longer, it'll fall back to the earth as precipitation, so liquid or solid precipitation. Once it hits the ground, it either runs off into the ocean to repeat the cycle, or it can soak into the ground and become groundwater. Either way, we have a complete cycle, and of course you've learned that one early on, so we won't spend a lot of time there. The carbon cycle is a little bit more complex. It's sometimes called the carbon-oxygen cycle. And the main 2 processes that occur in the carbon cycle or carbon-oxygen cycle that you need to know about are these opposites, photosynthesis and respiration, and you need to go which gases are being consumed and which gases are being produced by each. Again, photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide and produces oxygen. Respiration is the opposite. It uses oxygen. This is aerobic respiration, using oxygen, and producing carbon dioxide. So those 2 processes in themselves cycle carbon and oxygen in nature. The other things that contribute to this cycle, though, in addition to photosynthesis and respiration, would be combustion. The combustion or burning of any kind of fossil fuel, coal, oil, natural gas, it could be the burning of anything, wood, anything like that, does the same thing that aerobic respiration does. Burning always uses up oxygen and produces carbon dioxide. You've seen the experiment done with the candle and the jar over it. Eventually the candle burns out because all the oxygen becomes used up in the jar and carbon dioxide would build up there. Decomposition, when organisms die and decay, that does the same thing that aerobic respiration does. The bacteria will break down the cells of the organism, and gases will be released back into the air. So all of these things cycle CO2 and oxygen, so thus the carbon-oxygen cycle. This is a land carbon-oxygen cycle, and again we can see that the decomposition taking place here with the dead fox. So really the only thing, volcanic activity too, will release carbon dioxide and use up oxygen. It's kind of like combustion. So really the process that's different is the photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the only process that makes oxygen rather than using it. All of these others will use the oxygen up and produce the carbon dioxide. So again, atmospheric carbon is mainly in the form of carbon dioxide. It's added to the atmosphere by all of these processes: cellular respiration, volcanic action, and any kind of burning. And it's removed by photosynthesis only. Okay, so carbon dioxide, too much of it in the atmosphere, creates a problem known as the greenhouse effect. You hear this over and over again on the news. The greenhouse effect is sometimes referred to as global warming. The Earth is slowly warming, supposedly, according to many climatologists, because of the effect of greenhouse gases. And the number one most important greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide. That is being produced again by cellular respiration and combustion, any kind of burning process. And of course we're cutting down trees, which is shutting down sorry about the phone call there. We're cutting down trees, which is making the problem even worse, because the trees are the only thing, the autotrophs are the only thing that can help to get rid of this carbon dioxide that's building up. And so this little graphic at the bottom is showing the radiant energy of the sun coming in, but the long wave radiation gets trapped beneath the layer of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and so very little of that energy escapes, or some of it does not escape back into the universe. So if the heat is being trapped, the only thing that can happen over time is those temperatures are going to gradually creep up. Now, what are some other greenhouse gases other than carbon dioxide? One of the culprits is methane gas. Methane gas is produced mainly by livestock as a byproduct of the digestive process, if you know what I'm saying there. So that gas that sometimes escapes from the digestive tract of any kind of animal is typically a lot of methane. And cows especially, ruminant animals, can produce lots and lots of it. So this graph is actually showing you the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels in parts per million from 160,000 years ago to about the year 2000. So you can see a long time ago, those levels have fluctuated drastically. They've spiked, they've dropped, they've spiked, they've dropped. Now, according to scientists, man was not in the picture this many years ago. So these fluctuations could not have been due to carbon dioxide being produced by humans anyway. So we can't really explain why we have these little fluctuations here. But since humans have been in the picture, that's pretty much everything from, about here over, we can see that at least in recent years, the trend is that the carbon dioxide levels have been increasing. Now the big question is this increase in carbon dioxide that we think is contributing to global warming, is that a result of something we humans are doing, or is that just one of these uphill trends that we've had over and over again for thousands and thousands of years? Climatologists argue that point all the time, and we can't really prove it, but there are those that say it's because of humans and our interference in ecosystems, and there are others that says, no, this is just one of the normal spikes that we've seen many times before in history. The nitrogen cycle. This is the nutrient cycle that is most asked about on AP exams, and I will say it's kind of the hardest one. Nitrogen is one of those main limiting nutrients that we run out of very quickly in the environment. And it's important because it makes up amino acids and therefore proteins. It's in nucleic acids, which is DNA and RNA. So all living things have proteins and nucleic acids and need nitrogen. So where is this nitrogen? Well, most of it is located in the atmosphere, and it's in the form of nitrogen gas. A lot of students assume the main gas in the air is going to be oxygen. It isn't. About 79%. Am I getting that right? No, it's not 79%. It's 71%. About 71% of the air is nitrogen gas, N2, and only about 21% is oxygen. So if you add those together, that's 99% of the air. Nitrogen first, oxygen second. The problem is plants can't use nitrogen gas. Again, this nitrogen gas is N2. That's the main location of most nitrogen in our environment. Plants can only use nitrogen as either ammonia or ammonium, NH3 or NH4+, or plants can use nitrate, NO3, with a negative charge, or NO2 negatively charged, which is nitrite. So they can use these chemical forms of nitrogen, ammonia, ammonium, nitrate, nitrite, but not N2, which is nitrogen gas. So how do we get the nitrogen gas into a usable form? Well, bacteria do all the work for us. We're going to start with the left side of the diagram with this process called nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation, at least in a natural sense, yes, we can do this artificially with fertilizers, but in a natural sense, bacteria that live in the soil, called nitrogen-fixing bacteria, will convert it to ammonia and ammonium so that the plants can then take it in and use it. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria not only live in the soil, but they live in little nodules inside the root systems of certain plants. Not all plants, but some. The plants that have these nodules filled with nitrogen-fixing bacteria are legumes. Legumes are any kind of beans, peas, peanuts, clover. Those are the main leguminous plants that you would be familiar with. They all belong to the same genus of plant. It's the genus Rhizobium. Not that you need to memorize that, but those are the legumes that are filled with bacteria that do nitrogen fixation. And once nitrogen fixation happens, then the plants absorb the food. Now, there are other bacteria called nitrifying bacteria that carry out a process known as nitrification, in which they convert the ammonia and ammonium to nitrites. And then nitrites can be converted to nitrates. Well, this is still good because plants can use nitrites and nitrates. They can absorb that directly. So nitrification is still carried out by good bacteria. These bacteria only are living in the soil. They don't live inside plant roots. And then there are denitrifying bacteria that live in the soil that do the opposite. They convert the nitrate and the nitrite back to nitrogen gas so that the cycle can be completed over and over and over again. So these bacteria are very important. Now, the only arrow we haven't talked about is this one right here in the middle, and this process is labeled ammonification. When animals use the bathroom, their excretion has nitrogenous wastes. Urine is filled with nitrogenous wastes. Feces are filled with nitrogenous wastes. And when the urine and feces gets in the soil, bacteria called ammonifying bacteria will break it down and will convert it to ammonia or ammonium. And that's why urine has that ammonia kind of odor. That's the bacteria actually breaking it down, producing the ammonia, and that's what you're smelling. But when that happens out in nature, those feces and the nitrogen waste in the urine is converted to ammonia and ammonium, and then the plants can take it up and use it. So just to recap, plants cannot use nitrogen gas. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria convert the nitrogen gas to ammonia, NH3, or it can be ammonium, NH4, and the plants can take that up and use it. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria that live in legumes are great for the nitrogen cycle. We also have ammonification, which is bacteria that lives in the soil that converts nitrogenous waste in urine and feces to ammonia so that plants can use it. And we have nitrifying bacteria that convert ammonium to nitrites and nitrates. Again, usable, good stuff that the plants can absorb and use. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria, ammonifying bacteria, and nitrifying bacteria all are converting nitrogen gas or some other compound into a usable form. Then the only bacteria that would not make it usable are denitrifying bacteria. They convert the nitrates and nitrites back to the nitrogen gas. Okay? Now, also leaching, like runoff from rainwater, will wash nitrogen out of the soil and sometimes help to get rid of it. But the good bacteria put it back in the soil system. The phosphorus cycle is the only nutrient cycle that never ever includes the atmosphere. It is only found in the Earth's crust. There's no gaseous phase for phosphorus, yet it is an important limiting nutrient for plants. It's important because our phospholipids in our cell membranes are made of phosphorus. DNA and RNA, the nucleotides within DNA and RNA have phosphate groups, so we have to have, all living things have to have phosphorus. It is the most prevalent limiting factor in ecosystems, meaning we run out of it very, very rapidly. Now this looks very complicated, but actually this is kind of one of the simplest cycles. The phosphorus mainly is tied up in rocks and minerals in the crust of the earth. And how is it going to be released? Well, it's going to be released through runoff and weathering that will occur from precipitation. And it will wash into the water supply. And then when it's in the water supply, it can be taken up by the phytoplankton and other autotrophs like algae there. And it'll get into their system. And then when it's in their cells, then when they're eaten by larger organisms through trophic levels, it's passed on to other organisms. So the phosphorus cycle, just remember, it's mainly in rocks and minerals. It's released into the environment, in mainly the water, through weathering and erosion. Okay? What's the human impact? Well, we've already talked about the human impact and the questionable human impact with global warming and increases in carbon dioxide levels. But here's another big problem that we humans have created by our influence on ecosystems, and that is eutrophication of lakes. Now that's a big word. Eutrophication simply means an increase in any kind of nutrient level. Any of those that we've been talking about, like phosphates and nitrates and potassium, any kind of nutrient that gets washed into a body of water, like in this case a lake, will cause eutrophication. Now, since those are nutrients that autotrophs need for photosynthesis, when they first wash into that lake, photosynthesis starts happening like crazy. Algae especially will start to reproduce like crazy because it's getting all of these nutrients available to it. And it leads to what we call an algal bloom. You'll get an overgrowth of algae. If you look at this bottom picture, this is greenish because this water is slimy with algae. Now, at first, when there's lots and lots of algae present, what do you think would happen to the oxygen levels? Well, they're going to increase because the algae is photosynthetic. So at first, the oxygen in this water goes up. But after a while, all that algae starts to die. And when it dies, decomposition begins. Fungi and bacterial decomposers will start to break it down. And the bacteria will then use up all that oxygen in their cellular respiration. So at the end of this eutrophic cycle, what's going to happen is a condition known as hypoxia. Hypo means less. There's less oxygen in that water than there should be because the bacterial decomposition used it all up. So once we get rid of all the oxygen in the lake, this lake is pretty much a dead body of water. You have to have oxygen to support aerobic respiration and to support life. So you would find no fish, no living organisms in this body of water after a period of time. So how do these nutrients wash in? Mainly it's due to use of artificial fertilizers. Farmers put fertilizers on their fields, then it rains, it has to go somewhere. It goes into creeks, streams, ponds, lakes, and then eutrophication can be the result of that. But this can also happen due to sewage and factory wastes that run off into water supplies too. Years ago, before people had proper septic systems, their sewage was just ran out into the streams, and that would lead to eutrophications, which is not a good thing. The oxygen eventually is used up by bacterial organisms decomposing all that algae that started to grow as a result of the nutrients in the water. Another problem that we humans have created through burning of fossil fuels is acid precipitation. We typically call it acid rain, but it can be acid snow, acid sleet, acid precipitation. Technically, acid precipitation is not any precipitation with a pH less than 7. We know acids are less than 7, but it has to be a little lower than that to technically be classified as acid rain. I believe the magic number is 5.6. So if the pH level of the precipitation is less than 5.6, we consider it acid precipitation. And this is basically what could be the result of that. Most plants do not grow well in acidic environments. They will not grow in acidic soil. That rain leaches into the soil. So the plants literally die. And without the plants, that's going to affect our oxygen supply. It's going to affect our food supply because the producers are the base of the food chain. They're very, very important. And this diagram shows another problem that we humans have created through the use of toxins like insecticides and pesticides. This diagram shows us the effect of a pesticide called DDT. Now, DDT stands for some big, huge chemical name, but you don't need to know what the letters stand for. It was sprayed everywhere to kill all these insect pests, and of course it got in the water supply when they sprayed. And this DDT was ingested by little phytoplankton organisms in the water, and then the zooplankton was ingested by small fish, which were ingested by large fish, which were ingested by bald eagles. We're going up the food chain or up the trophic level here. Well, this process of biological magnification is simply where toxins, poisons like insecticide and pesticides literally become magnified in amounts as you go up a food chain. Yes, you lose energy as you go up a food chain, but look at these numerical values for the amounts of DDT in the zooplankton versus the small fish, the large fish, and then the bald eagle. The number is getting larger because these toxins are not water soluble. They're lipophilic. That means they're fat loving. They get concentrated and stored in the fat tissue of the body and never leave the body. They don't get washed out of the body in the urine. So they accumulate, as those eagles eat more and more and more fish, those numbers at the top of the food chain for DDT get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And the harmful effect of that is that DDT caused the eggs of the eagles to have thin shells. So when the females would incubate the eggs by sitting on the nests, the eggs would crack. And so the eggs would never hatch. So bald eagles became endangered because of the use of DDT and this process that we call biological magnification. Now, could these happen with other toxins, insecticides, chemicals that we're using in our environment? Absolutely. If that chemical substance is not water soluble, it will accumulate in fat tissues, and the levels of it will increase or be magnified at higher levels of the food chain, and that can potentially cause problems to those top animals in the chain, those higher trophic levels, at some point in the future. We don't know what the long-term effects may be. Again, we've already talked about the greenhouse effect, so we can kind of skip over that one. And lastly, we've got the effect of the destruction of ozone. Ozone is O3. It's 3 little oxygen atoms combined. There is a thin layer of ozone in the stratosphere of the atmosphere, which is above the tallest clouds. That's really the second layer of the atmosphere. And ozone is a good thing. It protects us against the ultraviolet radiation of the sun. We don't want to be fried by ultraviolet radiation. O3 absorbs it so that less of it reaches us. But unfortunately, our use of chlorofluorocarbons, which can also be called CFCs, breaks down that O3 and just converts it to O2, which is just good old normal oxygen gas. And oxygen gas doesn't protect us against UV radiation. So use of CFCs destroys our ozone. CFCs are found in all refrigerants, like refrigerator freezers, air conditioners, Freon that we talk about in our air conditioners. It has chlorofluorocarbons in it, and over time those are emitted into the atmosphere and break the ozone down. And the end result is we get more skin cancers, we get more cataracts on our eyes. What are the odds of getting skin cancer in your lifetime? 1 out of 3. Right now, 1 out of 3 people in this world end up with some type of skin cancer in their lifetime. So this is becoming a huge problem. And we've already done our biomes, so the last part of the PowerPoint is biomes, which we did in our introduction, so we can skip right through that. Good luck on your test.